Thank you for joining me for this episode of Deciphering the End Time, where I'll continue looking at Daniel's prophecy. And tonight we will be doing Daniel chapter 2, part 2. Last week in the program, in the first episode of this new series, looking at Daniel's prophecy, we looked at Daniel chapter 2 as it relates to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, a couple of things out of that just for a quick review, and then we pick up at verse 23 of the book of Daniel. Now, we recall Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that he did not remember, and he called his council, but it was really his wise men, sorcerers, soothsayers, who would tell him his dream, and then they would interpret it. Of course, they could not. As I shared last week, that they could not do such because this dream was from God. You see, if we clearly understand the realm of the spirit, let me go back a little first. The kings in those times, whether godly kings or pagan kings, they had with them, the godly ones had the prophets of God. They had access to them. For example, Ezekiel, he had Isaac, he had Isaiah. You recall Ahab, though he spent a lot of his time listening to the prophets of Baal, there was Micah and there was Elisha. So you had these kings and they had these prophets they had access to. Godly kings had access to the godly prophets. So too, the ungodly kings, they had access to the true prophets of God. But they spent their time listening to the prophets of Baal or false prophet. In this particular incident with Nebuchadnezzar, in that culture, they had their wise men, soothsayers, diviners, that they listened to as it relates to omens, to give them messages from the gods. And so in having this dream, Nebuchadnezzar, not remembering what he dreamt, wanted his soothsayers, diviners, wise men, his council, to tell him what he dreamt and also to interpret it. The difference with all of this is that, unlike on previous occasions where they could conjure up spirits, do necromancy, or look to the stars, they could not. Because the thing about a diviner is that a diviner is not someone sent by the Most High. A diviner gets his information from the spiritual realm, from a fallen being, i.e. Satan. Or it is demonic. Or, as Paul laid it out in Ephesians 6:10, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness. So these kind of wise men, soothsayers, diviners, those are their source. The thing about it is, because it's a pagan country, Daniel and the three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they themselves, because they could interpret dreams, they were placed along them and called wise men, but their source was God. Now, and this was the reason why the soothsayers and diviners, necromancers, Chaldeans, or wise men could not interpret, could not tell Nebuchadnezzar what he dreamt, and neither could they interpret it, because this time the source was God, and it required a prophet of God or a man of God to interpret this dream, to tell the king what it was and to interpret it. And so the king gave an edict that all wise men were to be destroyed. But Daniel found favor with the captain of the guard, and so he was brought before the king, and he told the king his dream, and gave him the interpretation. Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, "You, O king, were watching as a great statue, one of impressive size and extraordinary brightness, was standing before you. Its appearance caused alarm. As for the statue, its head was of fine gold, its chest and arms were of silver, its belly and thighs were of bronze. Its legs were of iron, its feet were of partly iron and partly clay. You were watching as a stone was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its iron and clay feet, breaking them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and gold were broken in pieces without distinction, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor that the wind carries away. Not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a large mountain that filled the entire earth. This was the dream. Now we will set forth before the king its interpretation." So he told the king his dream. Then he gave the king his interpretation. And I'm going this route because of also a comment I had on last week's episode. I received, and it needs some clarification. So Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom was the head of gold. Then he said, "After you, another kingdom will arise." So he's saying that the Babylonian kingdom will be replaced or will be preceded by the silver kingdom. It is inferior to the Babylonian kingdom. Then there will be a third kingdom. So it means Nebuchadnezzar was the first. Babylon, well, he didn't say Babylon, but we know it is. The second was silver, which is the Medes and Persians. We'll find out later. Third was of bronze. And the fourth was iron. While he didn't mention a fifth, what he states, though, is that they were a divided kingdom of iron and clay. So at that time in history, around 605 AD, that was the rise of the Babylonian Empire. It was preceded by a silver kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. Then it was followed by Greece. Traditionally, the view is that the fourth kingdom was the Roman Empire. Modern scholars, however, are debating that it is not Rome, but it is Islam. While Daniel didn't say there was a fifth kingdom, in the same way, he said that after your kingdom, he didn't say first, but he said after your kingdom will arise one inferior to yours. What we're seeing though in verse 41 is that there is really a fifth kingdom, or a fifth kingdom coming out of the fourth kingdom. It is still iron, but it is mixed with clay. And this is where I want to pick up tonight. So firstly, I want to clarify that you had different kingdoms. Babylonian was gold, Medes and the Persians were silver because it had the arms. Then the belly and the thighs were bronze. Greece, iron. I still kind of side with the Roman Empire. However, when it comes to the fifth, tradition says it's a revived Roman Empire. I am of a different view. But let's get into verse 44 tonight. So in verse 44, it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will raise up an everlasting kingdom. There's so many places I could go with this, but I want to, in order not to go ahead of myself, I want to stick right between verse 41 and 43. Like I said, there is the view that the 10 toes, and if you want an expose on the 10 toes, you could listen to last week's episodes of what I said about the 10 toes. This week, there is the view that the EU is the revived Roman Empire. And there's plausibility to it. And I'm going to share it. This is just my style. I'll give you all the views, but I have my view, personal view that I hold to. But I will give you all the views so that we can understand. Because first thing, I'm about educating you so that you can understand. I'm being objective and I try to be balanced. And then I'll give you my personal view. Now, a revived Roman Empire. Many have said it is the European Union. Truth be told, around the year 2000, when the EU really came forth and the euro became the currency, the main currency of the EU, I looked at it. I looked at EU with a bit of glee, because for me it was the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. More so, there was a piece in the Times, or was it Newsweek, where it says old empire, new empire. Basically saying what the new EU is really a reflection of the old EU of the time. Napoleon, and going even further, the Charlemagne Empire, the reign, well, they're all Caesars, right? But going as far back as Constantine and before Constantine. So they're saying old empire, new empire. And like I said, the currency was what jolted me. Am I of the same belief? I will let you know in a bit. But the EU According to some, in the prophetic eyes of God, the Roman Empire never ceased to exist. It fell from world dominion but was not destroyed. Truth be told, Rome wasn't destroyed. It broke up into different nation states. So it was not destroyed. It remains, has having continued to influence the world. And now in the last days, are reviving as a neo-medieval Roman Empire through the EU. Truth is, the EU is definitely playing a key role in um, in the in world history at this point in time. One view is that just as Israel was miraculously raised back by God in 1948 as a sign of last days prophecy, the Roman Empire was revived. It's about the same year that the Roman Empire was revived with the original beginnings of the EU. Yes, the European Union of Europe had its beginning at the same time as Israel, 1948. In the 1948 Congress, it was convened in Hague under Sir Winston Churchill's chairmanship. The European unification movement was led by statesmen of whom many would later become known as the founding fathers of the EU. This was the first move towards revived European unity that grew into the European Union. The EU is the only modern neo-empire that truly influences the entire world, whose existence sprang from the continuing remains of the original centers of the Roman Empire and its Roman Church. And it is a bona fide empire. An empire is an extensive group of countries under a single authority, and the EU is currently a union of 28 European countries, covering much of the continent with a single European currency called euro. Like I said earlier, that was my wake-up call. And a centralized political government headquartered in Brussels, where the European Parliament holds its meeting. And just as the Roman Empire, the EU experienced tremendous accelerated growth through extending its boundaries with the inclusion of new citizens into the Union through the principle of representative democracy. In addition, the member state nations of the EU, through its economic international cooperation agreement that are open to the world, as another 16 countries in Eurasia as associated members, which includes Israel. So there's this view that this is the revived Roman Empire. And look, like I said, I'm being objective, not throwing it out the window. A couple of things though is that then, because of the 10 toes, many persons were there's a point when it only had 10 nations, but no, it's at 28 plus. Like I said, there is an added 16 countries in Eurasia. So there's more. So it makes it a great trade block. But as it relates to the 10, that is gone through the window. No. Am I ruling out this view? No. I will show you how this fits in to another view. All right? There is, however, this particular view as it relates to the 10 toes. It's a very interesting view. And the guys that, which is a view I liked, I looked at, and this is the view that I hold personally. But there is the guys at cuttingedge.org that speaks also of the 10 nation prophecy. And it is called, based on the same Daniel 2:44, this is what it says. It is called the 10 Spheres of Influence International Reorganization. Now, and for them, the 10 toes, so comes out of the Club of Rome, is like this. There is, it is, in other words, 10 supernations, right? The 10 supernations are North America, which many would have heard of, the NAFTA, North America Free Trade Agreement. New name is USMECA, which was changed under the Donald Trump administration, but North America, so it's Canada all the way to Mexico. Then there's Western Europe, which is the EU. Then the third supernation is Japan all by itself. Then fourth, it's Australia, South Africa, and the rest of the market economy of the developed world, right? So it includes New Zealand and just South Africa. The fifth is Russia and the Eastern Europe. Then six, Latin America and the Caribbean. That is what we now call the Organization of American States, OAS. Then seven, North Africa and the Middle East. So everything from Northwest Africa all the way into the Middle East, inclusive of Israel. Then eight, Tropical Africa. So a portion of West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa, including Madagascar. Nine, South and Southeast Asia, which includes India. And the 10th one in the puzzle is China all by itself. In other words, all these, it will be, so what would happen then? Nations will lose their sovereignty and they will become a part of a economic supernation, a trade bloc. And let's give you an example as it relates to NAFTA. Under the presidencies of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, the support for NAFTA was created. The first Bush, George H.W. Bush, began the push to create NAFTA, but was unable to see it before he left office. President Clinton supports NAFTA, though he opposed it prior. So there was pressure between the Clinton and Bush team to pass this NAFTA bill in 1993, and so it was done. So basically, what is happening then is the Bible is saying to us that there will be 10 nations. How it will be set up, I've shared two views so far. EU and the 10 spheres of influence international reorganization. Now, of the two, which of the two fits the 10 nations the most? Because in EU, you're looking at 28 nations plus an added 16 Eurasian nations. Where does the 10 come from? However, with the 10 spheres of influence, you have a different picture. But there's also a third picture. There's also a third that we will look at tonight. And I did share that I did share with you that there is When it comes to the fourth kingdom in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, some modern scholars have stated that it's not Rome, but it's Islam or Arabic nations. I want to share with you this view, a revised look at Daniel chapter 8, the Arabized people of the 10 toes. Let me give you the title of the book. Daniel Revisited by Mark Davidson. Discovering four Middle East signs leading to the Antichrist. And I want to read what he states. First thing he said, one of the things he said, Islam is not just a religion. He says Islam is very different from any other religion, from any other realm. First of all, we Christians and Americans must realize that Islam is not just a religion. It is first and foremost a political system that has religious laws at its core. These religious laws are employed to run an entire society. Islam presents a plan in its writings for building a religious and political world community. This community is known as the Ummah in Islam. In this book, thereafter. All right, so I stop there. So the community is known as Ummah. Now, here's the main thing, where he states that, where he speaks of the Arabized peoples of the 10 toes. With regards to the vision of the metal statue in Daniel 2, it mentioned 10 nations represented by the toes of the statue, identifying the part of the world where these nations are located, since they rule with the Antichrist. Will tell us where the Antichrist will rule. Since it seems we must reject Rome as the empire of iron, we must reject France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and or the UK as the nations that will rule with the Antichrist. Therefore, the EU or any permutation of it cannot be the formation of the Antichrist kingdom. Instead, since the empire of iron is more likely Islam, we must consider and watch nations like Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Algeria, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Now that's 6 nations so far. To consider and watch these nations instead of the EU is a major step forward in our understanding of what is to come and what Bible prophecies say about these nations in the end times. It frees us to ignore developments in the EU and to instead focus our attention on developments in Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. Truth be told, on point as it is right now, yes, we have to pay close attention to Turkey on what is happening, especially with President Erdogan making some very bold statement, even saying one that Jerusalem belongs to us, that is to Islam. The Islamic realm's history matches well with the description of the feet in the statue in Daniel. So Daniel says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly baked clay and partly iron, so will be a divided kingdom, yet will have the same strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay, and as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now, the native peoples living in the United Islamic Empire in the 8th century AD did not remain united. The Islamic Empire fractured from within in AD 750. Various factions inheritship inheritorship from Muhammad. This is known as the office of the caliphate. Took control over various parts of the Islamic empire. The realm of Islam never fully reunited, and so various empires control most of the Islamic realm, such as the Ottoman Empire. Starting in the 1830s and continuing into the 1930s, the Islamic realm was carved up by the European powers except for Turkey and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Various political states such as Algeria, Egypt, and Iran were then given independence during the 20th century. The splintering of the Islamic realm into many states is a fulfillment of the words will not remain united in Daniel 2:41 and 43. Remember, these are the views of Mark Davidson in his book Daniel Revisited. Additionally, there seems to be a play on words in the original Aramaic text of Daniel 2:43. It involves the Aramaic word Arab. Our English word Arab comes from the Hebrew/Arabic word Arab, which is a person of Semitic origin living in or near Arabia. But the Hebrew/Aramaic word Arab also means to commingle or to mix. So our currently translated phrase, the people will be a mixture, can also be rendered in English as the people will be Arab. This is probably not what is directly intended in the translation, but the play on words is interesting. It is a known fact that following the conquest of the lands of Morocco to Pakistan by the Arabic Arabs Islamic invaders, Arabs by the millions migrated from the Arabian Peninsula and settled in all the major cities throughout the Islamic realm. They held all the important posts in administering the empire and intermarried with the local population. For this reason, the people of Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Morocco, and Syria are all considered Arabs, both by the West as well as by Muslims themselves. Many of these nations even form Arab League, which began its charter with His Excellency, the President of the Syrian Republic, His Royal Highness the Emir of Transjordan, His Majesty the King of Iraq, His Majesty the King of Saudi Arabia, His Excellency the President of the Lebanese Republic, His Majesty King of Egypt, King of Yemen. So basically, what Davidson is saying then is that the 10 toes will be made up of nations that are predominantly Muslim nations. So that's his thing, that it will be made up predominantly of Muslim nations. So basically, there are nations then that have come out of, they were under Roman rule at one point, but they are no longer. So nations like Egypt, Syria, there's Turkey, Greece, Libya. So they name 10 Islamic nations. Sorry, he names 10 Islamic nations that he thinks fits the bill of the 10 toes. And one of the reasons he also is pushing this view is also this. In Daniel's dream, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the other thing that was key is that it's the location of Babylon. Davidson's view is that after Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, everybody actually ruled Babylon. Not that they were headquartered there, but Babylon became insignificant with each preceding kingdom. So it was the head of gold. It was the city of choice under Nebuchadnezzar. But when the Medes and the Persians came, it was like silver because it wasn't the standard. The capital was elsewhere. By the time Greece came around, it got even worse because it was no longer very important because another city was the chief city or where the empire was headquartered. Then, if it's the Roman view, also the same thing. And so, he's saying that with all of these, Babylon appeal waned. And so everybody had Babylon as a part of their empire, but the importance of the city waned with each preceding kingdom. And so it was important nonetheless. And so with it being revived through Islam, remember, he states that Islam is not just a religion, but it's also a political system. I'd love you as listeners to, if you can get a copy of Mark Davidson's Daniel Revisited, it's a very good read because you're getting views that have been popular, and they have become popular just in recent years. Joel Richardson also has a book called The Islamic Antichrist. Very powerful book. It somehow has information that also is in Daniel Revisited. And then you also have another book written by another well-known televangelist, Unleashing the Beast, Pastor Perry Stone. And the other is Who is the Antichrist by Mark Hitchcock. And all of these books are pointing to Islam. Now, I want to tie this up. But before I tie this up, I want to, there's a portion of scripture in Revelation that speaks of 7 hills. And if I literally interpret that passage, because it was speaking of Mystery Babylon, then I'll definitely say Rome. But as it relates to the political side of things, for me, that's 7 hill. And there's something about hill in scriptures that we have to understand, especially as it relates to the end times. And I've learned this out of Isaiah 2. And there are other verses that speaks of hill. But in the Psalm, David speaks of who shall ascend to thy holy hill. But Isaiah 2 speaks of the mountain, the hill, right? Depending on the version you read. But it's really speaking of a kingdom, God's kingdom. And there was where I understood the Revelation passage of the 7 hills. The 7 hills, like I said, if I literally interpret that, Mystery Babylon. However, the 7 hills, watch this now, speaks of 7 kingdoms that has been against Israel. I could go back. We had in Daniel's dream, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, there's 5. There were 2 kingdoms before, Egypt and Assyria, because each hill represents kingdoms that has been against Israel, God's kingdom. All right. Now to tie this 10 toes prophecy. As it relates to the revived Roman Empire, while I'm not throwing it out the window, because that was the first view in coming into end time prophecies and understanding it. And I understood the revived Roman Empire view. But at that time, I didn't think of EU until like I said, until I don't remember if it was Time Magazine or Newsweek. I think it was Time Magazine. On the cover, it was a headline: Old Empire, New Empire, talking about EU and primarily as it relates to the euro. Now, this is a new currency as against many of the other currencies that are on the world stage. In Jamaica, where I'm from, the euro values more than the US dollars. Well, it's valued more than the Jamaican dollars. But it's this, as it relates to the exchange rate, only the pound sterling is more than the euro. That says something to me about the power of this trade block. But in tying it together, for me, the 10 spheres of influence fits the bill more than any of the other views. I'm watching the Islamic view, and I'm prepared to say I'm wrong if that's how it is. Because the truth be told, if one understands, especially the views on the Islamic Antichrist, it is a serious wake-up call because of what the Quran says about the Mahdi and how that view fits with what Scripture says about the one that is coming. So in tying it together, the revived empire, Roman Empire, I see how it fits into the 10 sphere influence. And I can see how easily, and I'm just looking a bit forward as it relates to the beast with the 10 horns, with the 10 crowns. That beast represents the final empire. And the crowns, first thing, the horns, 10 represents, is similar to the 10 toes. Bingo. The 10 toes are kingdoms. Likewise, the 10 horns are kingdoms, sorry. But the 10 horns has 10 crowns, which represents rulership. Kings, back to Daniel 2, it says, in the days of those kings, God shall set up a kingdom. So the final empire will be made up of 10 kingdoms that has 10 kings, which the crowns represents the 10 horns. The 10 crowns represents the leadership, that is the kings. Right? Now, the thing about kingdom in scripture a lot of times it's not a small nation, but it conquers territories or other nations. It is overruling a large geographical mass of land. Now, the 10 spheres, that is what represents. Let me give you an idea of what that looks like. There is a map, and if you look, this is from cuttingedge.org. If you look here, sorry, if you look, you can see my cursor. This is how the 10 nations will look. A little further up, here you see to the left of the screen what I spoke of earlier. Let's use number 1. This is the idea I'm speaking of as it relates to kingdoms. Bible is speaking of kingdoms. Kingdoms is not just a one nation. It starts there, but it spreads, it expands, it is a conquest. But I want to believe these are ready-made. And so this is NAFTA, Canada, United States, Mexico, in the green. 5, this is Russia and Eastern Europe. So you get the idea of a mass of land. You get the idea of a mass of land. What I'm saying then is, I'm not throwing out the Islamic one. It does make sense. And it could also fit very much in this. But I want to believe that the enemy, the Antichrist, is after everything this time around. And if we look at what Jesus said, he said, upon his return, all eyes will see him. Take clues from what he says. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached unto all nations, tribe, and people. In Revelation, the scripture says, when John described the throng that was before the throne of God, he said there are people from every tribe, nation, language, tongue. So why would it be then that the Antichrist empire would just be 10 nations in a region? Yet the kingdom message, remember, these are kingdoms competing now. Let's leave the 10 nations a bit. Let's look at the bigger picture. It is 2 kingdoms at war, the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. If, and what Jesus said is not if, it's so, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to all nations. It starts in the kingdom. The gospel message started in Jerusalem, and it spreads to the uttermost part of the earth. Why then wouldn't be that since it is two kingdoms at war, that the kingdom of darkness wouldn't want the whole thing as well? Why just a region? Think about it. I believe that this plan to reorganize the world into 10 supernation states or regions will eliminate the sovereignty of nations. And what it does is that it gives one king rule over one region each. So you're going to have 10 kings ruling over one region. And let's go back to EU, because at this moment, though it's not explicit, in a lot of, though it's not explicit, let me finish this and then I go there. As it relates to the European Parliament in Brussels, there is one person that heads EU. That person is in charge. Yes, you have the individual nations of EU. They are run by prime ministers, chancellors, or presidents. But there's still somebody who heads EU. The thing about it is, when these 10 nations are set up, the individual prime ministers or presidents of the various sovereign nations reports to the chief man or woman that heads the supernation. So you will have 10 leaders. Daniel 2 refers to them as kings. And so this is what Daniel 2 now says, that in the days of those kings, God will set up a kingdom. He also spoke of how these 10 nations will be destroyed. Where, as a matter of fact, it says the stone is hewn out of the mountain, and it rolls and it destroys the 10 toes. Really, the 10 kingdoms. That is what is smashed first. The reason why the others are smashed is because the 10 toes is a reflection of all of them. Want to get the idea? Revelation 13. That John describes the beast. And if you look at the beast of Revelation 13, with all the beasts that Daniel describes when he had his vision, it is a makeup of each of them. They're coming together. That is what is destroyed. And the kingdom made of stone fills the earth. If you want to get even a clearer thing of what you mean, Zechariah chapter 14 gives us a perfect example that when Jesus starts to reign on earth in the millennium, the nations that came up against Jerusalem, if they don't come up to worship him at the feast, they will have no reign. Because guess what? There will be none of these nations anymore. None of that type of kingdom. Because only the kingdom of God will stand. So, in wrapping up, as it relates to the 10 toes, I gave you 3 views. The revived Roman Empire, the 10 spheres of influence, there's the Islamic view that the 10 toes are Arabic, because Islam is not just a religious, but it's also a political system. In looking at it clearly, I can see how the revived Roman Empire would fit in the 10-nation sphere. And so, for me, right now, it boils down to two. But which is the right one? I still believe that the 10 spheres of influence is the thing. I believe that the 10 spheres of influence is the view that fits the 10 toes prophecy. But I'm open to be stand corrected as it relates to the Arabic view because it's logical. The thing about it, that's the region where all the biblical activities have taken place. But who to tell? It may still fit in the 10-nation prophecy. But as we go on in Daniel, there'll be more revealed. The thing about this program is, it is for us to think. It is not just for us to come and to hold a view. Like I said, the aim of this program is for us to think objectively. I'm willing to come and to share all the views so that you, the listeners, can hear what is happening. So that at the end of the day, if view 1 doesn't work and 2 doesn't work, but 3 works, you won't be disappointed. Not being dogmatic about any of the views. Yes, I have my personal view, and I will clearly tell you what it is, but still remain objective to say to you, these are the views. It's the same thing I speak of when I speak of the rapture. There are 5 views. I hold to a view, but being objective, these are the 5 views. It is for us to understand to make sense of what is happening and what is coming. Thank you for joining me. This has been the program Deciphering the End Times. Deciphering the End Times is a weekly end time discussion program brought to you by Rick Winter Ministry. I'm Pastor Rick Winter. Thank you for joining me. We are studying the book of Daniel. We look today at part 2 of Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Join me next week as we continue the program, Deciphering the End Time. God bless you.